Hello. Welcome to the fourth episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York, and my podcast is about culture wars, the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats and lying, instead of the real things and the big debates. I'll be talking to the players and commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening. And we'll have some fun and some gossip, and we'll ask some vital questions like, who makes the best suede loafers in Jermyn Street? My guest today is George Monbiot. George Monbiot was the first environmentalist activist I really clocked. I knew about the Greens, not much, but I knew they were big in Europe, and I knew about Caroline Lucas, once the only Green MP. And I knew in the back of my head that the majority of climate scientists, whoever they were, said we were at the 11th hour on global warming. And I knew that the climate skeptics were in the business of denying and distracting and delaying, all that, and that they were overwhelmingly people with skin in the game in the form of things like fossil fuel interests. And I'd read Jane Mayer's marvelous Dark Money, which showed that a collection of American billionaires were putting huge amounts of money into politics, backing think tanks and politicians who supported their case. Those think tanks and those politicians never said who was funding them. But the fact was, then and there, back in the last before the noughties decade, I wasn't that interested in environmentalism. I was interested in politics, the politics of manipulation and disinformation behind it all, and how those shadowy billionaires got their way by sponsoring culture wars and distracting us all. Gradually, I realized that there was one media figure, he wrote in The Guardian, of course, who was a sort of face of environmentalism, who was also very interested in all the political manipulation too. George Monbiot started as a broadcaster. He went to the BBC Natural History Unit after zoology at Oxford. And then he went to the World Service, then off to write his first book. So far, so very nice for a young man with a big C conservative background and what people now call an establishment education, Stowe and Oxford. But later, it all went a bit wild. He went to far foreign countries, got bashed up, arrested, pronounced clinically dead from cerebral malaria in Kenya. He did a lot of things, a lot of somehow connected things, which seemed to be all with the aim of consciousness raising. But when he started writing about how money was accumulated and power exerted secretly, way above and beyond the old flummery of Parliament, then I took notice. And his latest book pulls it all together. The Invisible Doctrine, the secret history of neoliberalism and how it came to control your life, spells out the key power play of the post-World War world. Good morning, George.
Good morning, Peter. Lovely to talk to you.
Before I ask you about neoliberalism, I'd like to ask you about your political awakening. What did it for you? What was the crucial place, book, mentor, all that stuff?
As you rightly say, my background was conservative. My dad was quite a big cheese in what's called the voluntary wing of the Conservative Party. In other words, he wasn't an MP, but he was very heavily involved in organising for them. My mum was a Conservative district councillor, and she became leader of the council, led it for 9 years. So very conventional, upper middle class Conservative background. And all the influences that surrounded me, particularly at school, were also quite conservative. And it wasn't really till I got to university and began testing the ideas I'd been brought up with against clever people, my peers at university, that I began wondering, actually, why they didn't stand up very well, how it was that some of them were so easily knocked down. And I've always been a very curious person. I've always wanted to expand my frontiers, and so I began exploring this. What is it? Am I arguing it wrong? Maybe if I argue it differently, then there'll be a different outcome. But no, still, the arguments on the other side seemed stronger. So this whetted my appetite for questioning the ideas that I was brought up with, for starting a process of re-examination, which continues to this day. And that was greatly accelerated when almost inevitably began being pushed into political conflict over the things that I love most dearly, which are the natural world, earth systems, our life support systems. It's been my passion since I was a small child. I'm mad about natural history, crazy about animals, plants, fungi, even bacteria. I love it all. And as I began work, I joined the Natural History Unit at the BBC with a very specific aim. I was very clear about it, and that's why they took me on. I said, you've got no investigative environmental programme making. That's what I want to do. And at the time, the BBC, as you know, was a much tougher, more investigative organisation than it is today. It was prepared to take the battle to political power to a much greater extent than it is now. And of course, you've documented better than anyone else what's happened to this organisation and the pressures it's been under. And so they took me on with that mandate. And as I began investigating environmental disasters and who was causing them, why they happened, it became very clear to me that you could not separate the politics and the economics from the environmental outcomes. In fact, they were driven by the exercise of power. And so if you were to confront those outcomes, you had to confront the power behind them. And this is a tough thing to do. It's always a thing which people would much rather not engage with, much rather not think about. And in fact, some of our large conservation NGOs in this country, like for instance the RSPB, I feel have been far too timid in engaging with power, in confronting power. And so very often it seems to me they don't cut to the heart of what's going wrong, which is perhaps why when we have perhaps the highest membership of green groups in the world, some of our green groups like National Trust, RSPB, Wildlife Trust are among the biggest NGOs of any kind on earth. Our wildlife is in free fall and we live in an environmental disaster zone. It's because we don't confront the power. Anyway, this became much clearer to me when I left the BBC after 2 or 3 years, principally because they were shutting down investigative journalism after Thatcher launched her coup against it, and Alistair Milne, the Director General, was forced to resign. In fact, the very next day, my boss came in and said, I've heard it from the top, no more investigative journalism. And I said, what? You can't have journalism if it's not investigative. He said, I know that, you know that, but this isn't coming from me. And so soon after that, I left, and I went off to do my own work to investigate huge issues happening in some very remote and very dangerous parts of the world, and to write books and do journalism about them. And it was in such places, such as West Papua, this occupied territory occupied by Indonesia, such as the Brazilian Amazon, such as East Africa, that I really saw what politics looks like when the gloves are off, when that veneer of civilization is stripped away, because, we pretend we're all very civilized here, but, we still beat people up and do terrible things. Well, there you could see the beating up and the terrible things that were happening, sometimes at the behest of the UK government, the US government, the World Bank, and the rest of it, particularly in West Papua. And I also became involved with resistance movements who were trying to fight the terrible things that were happening, the loss of people's land, the destruction of their livelihoods, the destruction of their forests, their rivers, their coral reefs, and the rest of it, and began to see just how powerful that resistance could be, even when it was very poor, illiterate people who were at the heart of the resistance, or maybe especially when it's very poor and illiterate people. And so when I came back to Britain, as you say, I got very ill, and after very nearly dying of cerebral malaria, I then contracted every other bug which came along. My immune system was shattered for a couple of years, and so I just couldn't keep travelling. So I came back to Britain, and I had a way in. I had an angle. I could see, for the first time in my life, I had an inkling of how politics works, of what really goes on beneath that civilized veneer which we're so good at in this country, and what it masks. And so documenting that and engaging with it became my life work.
Now, you're quoted as saying you regretted going to Oxford. Is that right?
Yes, it is right. So I don't regret the course I did, though I do find English courses far too narrow. I studied zoology. At the time in Oxford, you couldn't study even biology as a whole. It was arbitrarily split into plants and animals, botany and zoology, which is kind of ridiculous because the great majority of species on Earth are neither plants nor animals. And you can't really comprehend living systems without looking at all species and their interactions. And of course we did that, actually. It was really a biology degree with this ridiculous arbitrary distinction. But I also wanted to study philosophy and history and economics and all sorts of amazing, fascinating subjects. I mean, I'm interested in everything except machines, basically. And I found it very frustrating having such a restrictive degree, even though it enabled you to get it into quite a lot of depth. And I did have amazing lecturers and tutors, people like Richard Dawkins, John Krebs, William Hamilton, this extraordinary figure, remarkable people, remarkable teachers. But the culture didn't suit me.
Now, what's the generic for what you do? Activist? I mean, I call myself an activist in a very, very ironic way, because I never do anything. But what is the generic? You've done lots of things, and you've been to lots of places, and you've written lots of books. You even became a sort of pop star. But what's the linking theme?
Well, I guess I could call myself a campaigning journalist or a journalistic campaigner. I mean, I don't see the two things as having to be separate. Obviously, there's different forms of journalism, and we do need people who are just there to gather facts, as if there were such a thing as a completely objective and unchallengeable fact. But yeah, we need people who are clearly trying to be impartial and balanced, though, again, those notions need constantly to be interrogated, what they really are and what they aren't. But there is and should be a role for people who just say this is morally wrong. Here's something going on which is wrong and we should do something about it. Otherwise, you end up with everybody saying, oh, look at this fascinating phenomenon. All these people are being killed. All these rainforests are being cut down. Isn't this interesting? Let's have another report from it. And people do look for moral guidance, and I can't claim to be a moral leader or anything like that, but people look for someone saying, actually, this should stop. Actually, here's a better way of living. Here are some better ideas for how we can manage our relationship with each other, with the living world, with politics, whatever it might be. You need those people too. And and I'm saying this because I quite often get people telling me, well, campaigning journalist is a contradiction in terms. You can't be both things. And I think you can. And actually, certain people should. Not everyone by any means, but there's a space there. And the fact is, Peter, I couldn't be any other kind of journalist. It was never going to work, even from the very beginning when I was at the BBC, and so, well, the people cutting down the forest say, I'm not interested. I couldn't give a tinker's cuss what the people cutting down the forest say. They shouldn't be cutting down the forest.
Well, later, I'd like to come back to the whole idea of BBC impartiality. But first, tell me about the invisible doctrine, how you came to realize that this secret group, this secret ideology, and eventually this secret word, because you say nobody who's a neoliberal says neoliberalism. How did it come to control your life and my life and everybody else's life?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like some wacky conspiracy theory, isn't it?
Yes.
And indeed, it is a wacky conspiracy theory. We should distinguish between conspiracy theories, and a theory is a disprovable hypothesis for how the world works for which evidence has been gathered, and conspiracy fictions, which are stories for which there is no evidence or which have already been disproven. And of course, we're surrounded by genuine conspiracies, the post office scandal, the PPE procurement scandal, two very obvious conspiracies. There are plenty more. And this is a kind of meta conspiracy. It's, we have been conspired against. And we are constantly conspired against. I mean, this is what Musk and Trump are doing at the moment. They are conspiring against the interests of the American people. They're doing so quite openly. Doesn't stop it from being a conspiracy. So, the context for this is towards the end of the Second World War. 2 books were published, one by Friedrich Hayek called The Road to Serfdom, and the other by Ludwig von Mises called Bureaucracy, which encapsulated this new idea. The term was first coined in 1938 at a symposium in Paris, which they called neoliberalism. Now, it's not a great term. In fact, I think we should ban the word liberalism altogether because it just means whatever people want it to mean. It's become almost completely meaningless. However, it's the only term they gave themselves which actually isn't just completely deceptive. So nowadays people will call themselves sort of free market, pursuing free market politics. So we're a free market think tank. Neoliberalism's got nothing to do with free markets, quite the opposite. It's the means by which highly rapacious forms of economic activity are justified, and the social democratic state is rolled back, regulations are torn down, protest is stopped, and all the dysfunctions which we have subsequently seen materialise. Now, what neoliberalism says at heart is that politics is not the right way to solve our problems. Economics is the right way. This thing they call the market, exchange. Though, actually, when you look at it, you'll find that they're not remotely interested in markets. If you think of a market, you might think of a street market where there's a sort of equal exchange. The people who buy and the people who sell have roughly the same economic status. You can wander along and choose your apples from this stall or from that stall. It's not at all what neoliberalism is defending. It's defending a brute system of economic power. And it says that this thing it calls a market, which is really economic power, people with money, should be what makes decisions, should be how society is organised. It should be organised on these so-called market, i.e. economic principles. And anything which interferes with that economic organisation, such as taxation, such as regulation, such as trade unions, such as protesters, such, in fact, as democratic politics itself, should be either gradually or suddenly shunted out of the way to make way for economic power. And what economic power will do in neoliberal ideology is to enable a kind of natural order to establish. The best people will come out on top, the worst people will come out at the bottom. It's kind of Calvinist. You can tell who has been favoured by the invisible hand because they've got the money. You can tell who has been cast out of the kingdom of God because they're poor. And in its initial phases, it could be seen as an honest, if slightly wacky, philosophy. One generally regarded as pretty obnoxious by most of the people who encountered it, but it was of tremendous interest for extremely rich and powerful people. And very quickly, they recognised its potential. This could give us the opportunity to push out of the way all those things we don't like, such as regulation, such as taxation, such as trade unions, such as protesters, such as democracy. Because here we have an intellectual framework which enables us to justify these things that we want. And so they poured money into the initial organisation which Hayek and others set up, called the Mont Pelerin Society, set up in 1947, and then into what has been described as a neoliberal international, a global network of these so-called think tanks, these lobby groups for money, of academic departments, of sympathetic politicians, of government officials who were happy to do the bidding of the very rich, the concierges, in other words. And huge amounts of money were stumped up by literally some of the richest people and corporations on earth to establish something which then began to become very powerful, because what these think tanks and academic institutes were there for was to turn these obnoxious and outrageous ideas put forward by Hayek and von Mises and Milton Friedman and others into what sounded like political common sense, until we could be persuaded, in Mrs. Thatcher's oft-used words, that there is no alternative. This is the only way of doing it. And, of course, there are plenty of alternatives. There's always different ways of organising our society. But we almost ended up as if there is no alternative, because before very long, it wasn't just Thatcher and Reagan who picked this up, But it was the Democrats, and it was Labour as well. It was Clinton, it was Blair, it was Obama, and now it's Keir Starmer, pursuing the degradation of politics. What Will Davis at Goldsmiths rather wonderfully describes, his definition of neoliberalism is the disenchantment of politics by economics.
What do you think those people, I mean, the people starting with Clinton, the people who you say were in effect compromised by all this money and influence and by the ideas themselves, how would you think they'd put their defense, working incrementally against the odds to make a better world, etc.? You have to put some of your adolescent sympathies away and. How is that defense narrated now?
Well, to put it broadly and crudely, throughout my entire working life, almost everyone anywhere to the left of Genghis Khan has been explaining to us that we can't hope for system change. All we can hope for is incremental change. We can just tweak things a little bit. We can have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and one day they will add up to the change we want to see. And if we ask for any more, we'll alienate the electorate, we'll piss off powerful people, be it Rupert Murdoch, be it Charles Koch, whoever they might be, and that will make it impossible for us to get elected or to stay in power. So we can't go down that route. It's just impossible. People won't come with us if we ask for too much. So don't ask for too much. Just ask for a little bit. It's the politics of the possible, we're constantly told. And throughout this time, first of all, the neoliberals, and now the radical right, the far right, have said, we want system change. Here's how we're going to achieve it. And oh, look, we've achieved it. And they've completely transformed the world we know. They've transformed our politics, transformed our economics, transformed our relationship with the natural world, all in disastrous ways. They have achieved system change. And right now, as we speak, the far right, Trump, Musk and the rest, are achieving system change all over again. They've been effectively created by neoliberalism, but they're not in all respects neoliberals by any means. There's lots of, far right is always highly opportunistic. It just picks up whatever is useful to it. And they're changing things all over again in a very dramatic, very quick and very radical way. It's a lie that we can't have system change. Of course we can have system change. We're seeing system change all the time. And in fact, system change is the only kind of change we ever can have. What is the politics of the possible, what is politically realistic is system change. Incremental change is never realistic. It can't happen because while you're pursuing incremental change and someone else is pursuing system change, they're going to roll you over. That's always how it happens. The only way you're ever going to get significant change is like John Maynard Keynes and Clement Attlee or many other figures through history, is pursuing systemic change and rolling over your opposition. That's the only way it's ever going to happen. But this timidity, which has kicked in since about 1980, where none of the formerly left or even centrist parties almost anywhere on earth are prepared to ask for anything more than a few tiny tweaks to the system, that is a recipe for defeat. And that defeat is what we now witness everywhere, from Argentina to India, from Germany to Brazil under Bolsonaro, in the Philippines, all over Europe now, in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Finland, in the Czech Republic, in Austria, in Italy. We see defeat, 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 defeat. And of course in the US, big time. Because if you are too small, if you ask for too little, if your vision is cramped and limited, you will be destroyed by people who do not accept those constraints.
What's the secret sauce in talking about the appeals of first neoliberalism to ordinary people, big electorates whose real self-interest they didn't serve at all? How was it actually done? If you put the basic idea that if you took the Congress of Billionaires, the Global Congress of Billionaires, and asked them what they wanted, nobody would vote for that. And yet somehow that was magicked into something that was very attractive and very votable. How was it done?
Sure. No, this is the key question, and it's a really essential one. I'm so glad you've asked it. It's amazing, actually. No one ever asked this question, but it's the most important one of all. So a big part of the ingredient of that sauce is money, and lots of it. What money enables you to do is to buy very clever people. And all over the world, they've recruited extremely able, hard-working, hard-nosed people who can put an argument together, who can translate outrageous ideas into something that sounds sensible. And these people in the think tanks, the junk tanks as I call them, in the academic institutes and everywhere else that the billionaires have sponsored, they've honed and honed and honed these ideas to make them sound publicly acceptable and to make it sound as if there is no alternative. They become the hegemonic common sense. So that's part of it. But what they've also done, and very strategically and very intelligently, and we have to hand it to them, and we have to recognise that there's stuff here that we can learn, and we need to learn. They've taken the long view, and they've recognised something absolutely fundamental to politics, that it cannot change without a story of change. I mean, we don't even have a theory of change. They not only had a theory of change, they had a story of change. And that story of change, that political narrative, is absolutely essential. And one of the things that I noticed looking back, over hundreds or thousands of years of history, is that every significant political or religious shift has been accompanied by a particular narrative which follows a particular structure. Now, as you know, there's been a lot of argument how many basic plots are there. Maybe there's 3, or there's 5, or there's 7, or there's 9 basic plots. It's always an odd number for some reason, but people argue about this. But no one argues about what one of those basic plots is, though they might give it different names. I call it the restoration story. And it's a very common one, a very successful one in fiction or in religion. And it runs like this. The land has been thrown into disorder by powerful and nefarious people working against the interests of humankind. But the hero or heroes stands up, confronts those powerful and nefarious forces against the odds, overthrows them, and restores harmony to the land. It's the New Testament story. It's the Harry Potter story. It's the Lord of the Rings story. We hear this story again and again, but it's also the political story that works, the only political story that works. John Maynard Keynes told it to great effect. Karl Marx told it to great effect. Adolf Hitler told it to great effect. Right across the political spectrum, political movements that succeed, one of the absolutely necessary formulae, necessary ingredients in that secret sauce is that story. Is that a story built around that narrative structure? Because what the story tells us is this is where we are and this is why we are here. This is where we want to get to and this is how we're going to do it and this is what it will look like when we arrive. And it's a story which innately appeals to us. We do have a predisposition towards hearing certain basic plots, and this is one we really love to hear. And it's one which gives people vision and hope and an idea of where things are going. And very consciously and deliberately, because they understood this and understood it more consciously probably than any political movement that had preceded them, the neoliberals crafted that story. And they knew it would take a long time before people were ready to hear that story. They would have to wait, or not wait, they would have to help accelerate the collapse of Keynesian social democracy, which capital did very successfully by ripping down capital controls, ripping down foreign exchange controls, and many other methods. There were some, what economists call endogenous causes of the trouble that Keynesian social democracy ran into, but also these exogenous causes of basically attacks by capital, often driven by neoliberal strategizing. And Milton Friedman, one of the foremost exponents of neoliberalism, said, way back we started planning this. We knew it would take a generation for it to happen. We got all the elements together, and when the time came, we were ready and we could step right in. That's what he said. And they were ready because they had this fully crafted story. They had this massive infrastructure of justification. They had this whole apparatus for persuading people that this was the only alternative to the failing Keynesian system in the late 1970s. And so they were able to tell this new story. Well, that worked very well for them, and it carried them through until 2008 when neoliberalism collapsed. And we saw what neoliberalism does. By deregulating the financial sector, it caused the collapse of the financial sector, as well as causing lots of other kinds of collapses, but that was the one we all knew about. And so that was the golden opportunity for those of us who oppose neoliberalism to step forward and say, right, here's the new story, this is what we're going to do. But we didn't have one. We had completely failed to develop a new narrative with which to replace the failed one. And that's why we ended up stuck with neoliberalism. That is the absolutely clinching reason why this zombie doctrine staggers on even after it has failed financially, failed politically, failed morally, failed philosophically. It is bankrupt in every respect, and yet it still dominates, except it's now being overtaken by the fascism that it has enabled.
When you had Margaret Thatcher saying, Tina, what she seemed to mean was, and certainly what people implied later was, that most of the left couldn't run a bath, and that you needed special competencies to make money for yourself, and then trickle down would follow. Whereas people on the left wore funny clothes, talked funny, and couldn't run a bath. Has anything changed there?
Well, so the people with the special competencies that she identified were the entrepreneurs. The private enterprise is efficient, is effective, it runs things much better than the state ever can. So look, we're privatising water. Later on, John Major privatised the railways. We'll privatise everything that isn't nailed down and quite a few things that are. And so we end up with people running a bath full of shit. Because what happens is that private enterprise is very good at pursuing its own private interests, but those are massively different to the public interest. And inbuilt in all privatization is a conflict between the private interest and the public interest. And what Thatcher believed, and she genuinely believed it, I'm not saying this was a false belief at all, but she genuinely believed that because people in the private sector were good at making money, they would be good at everything, and that they were universally competent. But what we know, what we can see very clearly, is that competence in one field often happens at the expense of competence in other fields. You can become really good at one thing by shutting down your capacities to do other things. And that's especially the case when you're talking about institutional capacity. The institutional capacity of private enterprise is fully focused on turning a profit. That's fine. That's what they do. That's their job. But their job is not running government departments or managing public services. They do that very badly indeed because it directly conflicts with their desire to make a profit. And as we've seen with water privatisation, you will rinse the sector, so to speak. For every opportunity to make money, you will extract dividends by the tens of billions, and you will fail to invest even in basic infrastructure like sewers, like sewage farms, like reservoirs, because investment doesn't pour money straight into the pockets of your shareholders. And so we end up with an absolute catastrophe, which the state then has to pick up. And the fundamental problem with Thatcherism and all that has followed, including the neoliberalism of Tony Blair and Keir Starmer, is that the private sector keeps the profits and the state keeps the risk and carries the costs, because public services can't be allowed to collapse completely. As Tony Judd pointed out, there would be a revolt if there were no water or no electricity or no trains or other essential public services failed. The health service, education, whatever, you couldn't contain the political turmoil that would result. So you can't let them fail. So however big a mess the private sector makes of it, the state has to come in and pick up the pieces. And the private sector knows this. Private sector is fully aware of this. They're not dumb. They're very clever people often who are running these corporations or who are the major shareholders, and they know that they can just extract and extract and extract because someone else will pick up the tab at the end of the day.
Now, you say this, and this all sounds a relatively polite phase of neoliberalism, but you've been using the F word. Is modern America, new America, Trump's administration, is it fascist?
It's certainly got elements of fascism. I mean, I'm not massively keen on getting into deep arguments about whether the label precisely fits or not. I mean, what we're seeing is a reversion to empire. We're seeing they're trying to kill democracy effectively and revert to an oligarchic model of political governance, which is the default state of centralized hierarchical countries. And in doing so, they are crushing the hopes, the aspirations, the quality of life of their own people and indeed of people around the world, and devastating the living world. Now, the question behind your question, I think, is, did neoliberalism make this happen? And I believe very strongly that it did, because by disenchanting politics, by basically saying politics is not there to solve your problems, politics shouldn't even try to solve your problems, the state should be shrunk, the state is the enemy, the government is your opponent, it should not be taxing you, it should not be regulating corporations, not be obstructing money. And because politicians were stupid enough to believe this, they have done less and less to change social outcomes and to improve our lives. And people might look to the state to protect them, they might look to the state to solve their problems, and the state has deliberately incapacitated itself. No, we can't has become the tacit motto of Conservatives and Labour, of Republicans and Democrats. We don't have the money, we can't do that. No, don't expect us to do anything like governing. What do you think we are, the government? There's this sort of deliberate effort over decades now to reduce the state's ability to change social outcomes and improve our lives. And so when people look from Labour to Conservative to Labour, for example, and they don't see that fundamentally changing. They see austerity being sustained. They see harsh cuts to the welfare state being sustained. They see public services continuing to fall apart. They see the rivers still full of shit. They say, well, a pox on all your houses. You're not solving our problems. You're talking above our heads. So let's try this nice Mr. Trump or this nice Mr. Farage, because they claim to be outside of all that. They claim that they're not politics as usual. They claim that they're going to sweep all that nonsense away. And of course, what then happens is you get someone who becomes an uber neoliberal. You're responding to the corruption of politics by money, and you end up with the ultimate corruption of politics by money, because the far right always lies. That's what it's there for. It's just a massive, great lying machine which deceives people as to its intentions and deceives people as to its effects. But it's a very effective lying machine, and people turn to it when they feel their other options have been exhausted.
But you said that hitherto, neoliberalism made sure that ultimately some basic public services did not fail, otherwise people would revolt. The track that they're on in America looks like it's going to end up inevitably with a lot of public services visibly, tangibly failing. And what happens then? They're not worried about the cosmetics of saying we're desperately supporting Medicaid or any of that. Large federal organizations will disappear.
I think we could be on course for systemic collapse in the United States. I mean, they're about to discover just to what extent society and the nation as a whole depends on the federal government. And if you rip that rug away from under it, all sorts of things start to topple. So just to give one example, they are systematically deregulating finance. In fact, this guy Russell Vogt has come into this Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, I think it's called, apparently with the explicit aim of deleting it, in Elon Musk's word.
Yes.
Now, this is one of the bodies that was set up in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis to prevent that sort of crisis from happening again, to protect consumers from predatory financial behaviour, which destabilises the whole financial system. Oh, well, let's just delete that. We don't need that. That's government interfering. We have all these financiers, very nice people they are, quite a few of them are billionaires, telling us that they don't want this bureau anymore, so let's just get rid of it. The world's richest man says delete it. So it gets deleted. And a whole load of other essential regulatory bodies like that are being torn down. What's the likely result of that? Well, I mean, they're basically saying, well, fill your boots, boys. You can do what you like now. And we saw exactly what happened when that was the case in 2008, but also in 1929 and in a whole series of previous financial collapses. But, they're not just doing it there. They're doing it on the environmental front as well. They're doing it on all forms of consumer protection. They're doing it on public health. When the next pandemic arrives, and I say when because there will be another pandemic, the defences are being stood down. People won't be able to get vaccines. Quarantine won't be accessible. There won't be any of the basic public defences. And then what happens? Millions and millions of people die. Spontaneous economic shutdown happens. We're looking in several respects at the preconditions for systemic collapse being introduced. And as you say, they don't care. I mean, some of them are millenarians. Some of them think, great, bring on the apocalypse because we'll sit at the right hand of God and everyone else will roast. Some of them are tech millenarians. We're heading for this Kurzweilian singularity. We're going to fuse with machines. We'll leave everyone else behind. Some of them are interplanetary millenarians. We'll all bugger off to Mars and leave in space. They don't care. They don't care at all. Basically, the far right doesn't care. It doesn't care about anyone or anything. It just cares about its own wealth and power and ability to beat other people up, which often is the most important thing for it, because beating other people up is really its only source of satisfaction. And so it's got none of the restraints that previous generations of politicians have had.
And where is media in all this? Where is media with its bold mission of truth to power? Where is British media in all this? And where, in particular, is the BBC in all this?
Yes. So, I mean, when I started work in the media, I started, as I think so many young journalists did at that time, with high ideals. We're going to speak truth to power. We're going to hold power to account. That's what we exist for. And I also had a very naive belief that the problem was an information deficit. If only people understood more about what's going on in the world, then things will automatically change. I had that sort of naive belief that that's how democracy works, that's how things happen. I have quite quickly been cured of all of that. But what we see is that the media is a major player in these dysfunctions. Neoliberalism would have been impossible to spread so far and so wide were it not for the huge support they received in the media. In fact, there's a book which I suspect the author strongly regrets having published, which is Madsen Piri's autobiography called Think Tank. And Madsen Piri was the founder of the Adam Smith Institute, one of these classic neoliberal junk tanks that we're talking about. And these people, for decades, have kept their cards very close to their chest. They do not want us to see how they operate. But he was foolish enough to describe how they operate and what they did to establish their role and their power. And he talked about how every Saturday he and other people from the Adam Smith Institute and people from the Institute of Economic Affairs and other of these Tufton Street junk tanks got together with senior SPADs and other officials in the then Conservative opposition. This was after Mrs. Thatcher became leader in 1975, with editorial staff from the Daily Mail, the Times, the Telegraph, and other newspapers, and they plotted out strategy for the week ahead. And he explains how, sitting in the cork and bottle, they would say, right, we, the Adam Smith Institute, are going to bring out this report which says that the welfare state is too big, or the NHS is bloated, or we shouldn't be running water publicly, it should be privatised, whatever it might be. And then the person from the Daily Mail or the Telegraph will say, right, we'll write an editorial about that, supporting you. At the Mail, David English, the editor, personally oversaw those editorials. He was completely invested in this project of turning junk tank ideas into popular journalism. And then Thatcher's team would say, right, we'll work this up into policy. We'll look at how we could introduce legal mechanisms to make this happen. It was completely coordinated. You know, when people tell me, oh, that's a conspiracy theory, I say, yeah, it is. Here's a conspiracy. Here it is. It's written down by the guy who was doing it.
I can remember him, David English. He offered me a job. Amazingly, I didn't take it, but not out of high-mindedness, but because he wanted me to write more of the same, and I was slightly bored of that by now. But it was sort of name your price situation. It was really very interesting. But what about the BBC?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes, the BBC. Well, it's just become this wee flicket, timorous, cowering beastie by comparison to what it was before. I mean, it was a bold go-getter organisation when I joined it, you know, and it was really brave. It did some amazing things. And in fact, it was for that reason that Thatcher launched her coup against it. Principally, it was two things it had done. It had made a programme called Maggie's Militant Tendency.
Yes.
Showing how some of her front benchers had been fascists in their youth, members of the Monday Club and stuff like that. It also made a series called Secret Society, looking at unauthorised military and surveillance spending by the government, which hadn't gone through Parliament. You know, this is proper journalism. This is what journalists exist to do. And it was, you know, really good, strong, punchy stuff, proper, decent investigative journalism. And Thatcher, very tellingly, you know, for all this sort of talk of free speech and freedom, you know, just like Elon Musk, loves it when it's her side doing the free speech, hates it when it's someone on the other side doing the free speech, said, right, we've had enough of this, and forced Mill's departure, put in a poor hapless accountant called Michael Checkland to take his place, a man who had never made a programme. I mean, not a bad guy, but just, you know, completely out of his depth. And then we ended up with some really sinister characters, and with the BBC just spiralling. I mean, it's been devastating to see what's happened to it since. It's never recovered its nerve since then, and in fact, it just seems to get worse and worse.
What is it about? Is it about the 40% plus in real terms reduction of funding? Is it about the enemy within, that there are ultra-right-wing moles in the BBC? What is it?
Well, all of the above.
That's the charge, that's the charge that some people make.
Yes. I mean, it's all of the above. They definitely, people like Robbie Gibb and other of these, I think, very disturbing characters who have been foisted onto the BBC. I mean, including the new chairman of the BBC. You know, this is, you know, really direct top-down state control of the national broadcaster, but also, of course, the threat of taking away the licence fee or further erosion of the licence fee is a very effective way of disciplining it as well. But a part of this too comes from the BBC itself. It just hasn't shown the guts to stand up and say, okay, you want a confrontation, we'll have a confrontation, and we'll see which side the public comes down on, because it might not be yours. And instead, it's just folded and folded and folded. And, you know, once you start flinching, you never stop flinching. There's no end to appeasement. And we've seen how the BBC more or less created figures like Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg from whole cloth. It just made these people into the political figures they became by giving them endless airtime while freezing out people who were challenging capitalism, challenging the system, challenging economic power, hardly had a say. I mean, one or two exceptions occasionally you get invited on, but it's much, much rarer than these very awful dark money figures, far right and the rest of it, who have just been given almost blanket coverage.
Have they, the BBC, sufficiently explained to real people in real places who do real jobs and aren't geeks and don't follow all this stuff because they've got a life and they live outside, in Westminster. It's all up the road. But if you live in a real place called Rotherham or Rutherglen, you never meet anyone who is a hedge fund trader. You never meet anyone who works in a think tank. You never meet anyone who works in lobbying. So you don't know, in effect, that sort of comfy trade-off made in a pub in Fleet Street actually works, because you don't even know that those sorts of human beings with those sorts of jobs actually exist. And I remember when I used to go out and do group discussions around the land, and I used to ask people who had all the money and the power, they didn't know, meaning they came up with the idea of the toffs, the remainder of the toffs, famous, what I call celebrity business people, and celebrity everybody else, people in show business. They had no idea who actually had the realest, biggest money. And why should they?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're quite right. And far from explaining this, the BBC whitewashes it, sanitizes it, and disguises it. So endlessly, I mean, almost invariably, there's scarcely a news or current affairs programme which does not have someone from one of the junk tanks. And they never explain who these people are, where they get the money from. This is a direct breach of BBC editorial guidelines. It's in the guidelines very clearly. If there's someone from a think tank appearing on your programme, you should be saying who is funding them. They never do. And these people are basically corporate lobby groups. If you had someone from an acknowledged lobbyist, Burson Marsteller or something like that, coming on saying, yes, we think the tobacco industry is wonderful and everyone should be smoking more cigarettes, you would say, right, well, we know who you are, you're a plonker, we dismiss you out of hand. But when you have someone say, yes, I'm from a think tank and we think about things, and we think that actually the government restrictions on cigarette advertising are far too onerous and they should be removed, and you don't know that they're actually being funded by the tobacco industry, as many of these groups have been for many years, you are being deceived. You're being deceived as to who's speaking. You're being deceived as to what their interests are, on whose behalf they are speaking. And yet the BBC presents these people as if they're objective commentators who happen to take a so-called free market position. From the free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, from the free market think tank, the Taxpayers Alliance or whatever, there's nothing to do with the free market. It's about economic power. It's about the brute power of corporations and oligarchs. We are misled on a daily basis by the BBC.
Have they ever answered that complaint?
God, I have tried and tried. I've been stonewalled. Many others have as well. I mean, Carol Cadwallader actually managed to get to Tony Hall when he was Director General and spoke to him directly, and he promised, yes, this is going to be sorted out. It reverted to type within 2 weeks. Nothing changed. And when I've tried, I've had the most ridiculous excuses. I mean, at one point, there was a complaint had just been put in against Peter Lilly, Tory MP, who was speaking on, I think it was Newsnight, taking a position favourable to the oil industry, and they hadn't mentioned that he was on the board of an oil company. And when someone complained about that, the response they got, well, it's in his register of interests, it's in the public domain, so we didn't need to say it. 2 weeks later, I made a complaint about the Institute of Economic Affairs coming on the Today programme, arguing against better regulation of tobacco, saying, it's completely outrageous that we should be regulating the tobacco companies the way we are and we shouldn't regulate them any further, etc., etc. And I pointed out that the fact that they have been sponsored by the tobacco company since 1963 was not mentioned. The BBC said, well, we didn't need to mention that because it's not in the public domain. So within the course of 2 weeks, you had them arguing that they don't need to mention someone's interest because it is in the public domain, and they don't need to mention someone's interest because it's not in the public domain.
Now, you've got...
Before we go any further, I'm going to have to dash for my train very shortly.
You've got to go off to serve the BBC.
I know, it's crazy, isn't it?
Question time. So there's only one question remaining.
Yeah.
What are you going to wear? That's the really important thing. And I'm not joking.
I know, well, it's the hurdle at which I always fail. As you could probably tell, I got no dress sense at all. But I will be very conservative and sober in my dress, because I think, if people are going to listen to what you say, you don't want them saying, "Who's that bloody hippie?" So I will wear a jacket and I will iron a shirt.
And at some point, you've got to come back and say where the glimmer of hope might be.
Totally. Yeah.
Whether it's a group of people, a particular person, we must look out for saviours, or what exactly?
Yeah.
Because it sounds a slightly, massively grim 11th hour world that you're painting.
Well, I mean,
thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And just to say, yeah, we do. I mean, in the book, there's quite a lot about the better world we can create. But anyway, look, total delight talking to you. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
Keep up your brilliant work, which I massively admire and follow. Thank you.
Many thanks to George Monbiot. The next episode of my podcast is out only a week away, with a very interesting mystery guest. Do join me then. Goodbye.